Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective here. Recently I did a video contrasting the positions of Pastor John MacArthur and Pastor Andy Stanley in regard to whether churches should shut down during the COVID-19 situation. MacArthur has decided to have his church open during this time, whereas Stanley has closed their indoor in-person worship services on Sundays, although they are meeting at other times and in other ways. So I saw that recently, actually last week, I believe, these two pastors did a Q session, and I do not have access to the video, but this website here talks about featuring perspectives from Andy Stanley, Why We Stopped Meeting, and John MacArthur, A Time to Disobey. And I did see an article on this from ChristianPost.com dated September 5th. It says, John MacArthur urges churches to challenge government and reopen amid pandemic. Andy Stanley disagrees. So this is talking about that Q session interaction they had. Pastors John MacArthur and Andy Stanley, who are both influential Christian leaders, presented dueling advice on how churches should respond to government restrictions amid the pandemic this week, with MacArthur urging pastors to open because the supposed need for indefinite lockdowns is a lie, while Stanley recommended cooperation. Both MacArthur, who leads Grace Community Church in Sun Valley, California, and Stanley, who leads North Point Community Church in Alpharetta, Georgia, shared their thoughts on the controversial issue during a Q session discussion with moderator and Q Ideas founder Gabe Lyons on Wednesday. MacArthur, who's been locked in an ongoing public dispute with Los Angeles County over his decision to hold indoor Sunday morning worship services for his thousands of members, argued that while it's crystal clear that God has ordained government, he will no longer aid and abet the lie of the ongoing lockdowns in response to COVID-19. Being a pastor means you're a truth teller. That means you're a truth teller when it comes to the Bible. That means you protect your people from deception that comes from the world. That's part of being a shepherd. You don't want to aid and abet the lie. This is a lie, and you can't necessarily say that everybody that's involved in it has an ulterior motive, but the lie is dominating, and you need to be a truth teller, and you need to do your homework, MacArthur told Lyons. Health mandates and governor's orders are not law. I don't think you have to fear that. You need to open the church because this, of all times, when people fear, is where they need to come. I don't think you have to give a clinical explanation. I think you have to welcome them and not make them follow protocol that you know is pointless, he said. More than 6 million cases of the new coronavirus have been confirmed in the United States, along with 187,000 deaths as of Friday evening, according to data compiled by Johns Hopkins University. Despite the numbers, however, MacArthur argued that he doesn't believe that COVID-19 is the threat public health officials claimed it would be. Later in the article, it goes on to quote MacArthur here, I think corporate worship is the stimulating of one another, love and good works as we come together. Even the early church came together. They didn't have their own buildings, so they went to the temple collectively. All of them who were there. There were thousands of them there, he explained. So that's MacArthur making the case for gathering, continuing to gather during the COVID-19 situation. The article goes on to say Stanley, whose megachurch suspended Sunday morning worship services for the rest of the year, based on what's happening in the Atlanta area and the areas where our churches are located around Atlanta, said their decision was based on loving their neighbors. I talked about that in the last video. You can watch that if you haven't. This was just our way of loving our neighbors and loving our neighborhoods, trying to keep our neighborhoods safe as we get closer to school reopening, he said. He explained that reopening schools in the area had become very complicated, and his church didn't want to present another potential super spreader environment in that conversation. A little further down, Stanley noted that North Point is still doing weddings, funerals, and small groups, along with other innovative gatherings. He said that he wouldn't support general civil disobedience among churches against government restrictions because he thinks it's unnecessary and churches aren't being overly burdened because they can gather in other ways. In light of what's happening now, there is no reason to push back because I think every evidence is our state and local and federal government is trying to figure out a really big problem, he said. Nobody is trying to shut down the church in America unless we think there is a link between SEC football, the NFL, the NBA, and everything else that's been shut down. And I can't speak to what's going on in California. I'm like everybody else. I just read the news, he said. I can't imagine a scenario in the United States of America where the only group being picked on is the church unless it's a specific local church. But every local church has to operate within certain guidelines given by the government. Have you ever tried to get a land disturbance permit? There's all kinds of fire codes, building codes. It's okay for the government to speak into when we meet, noise ordinances. It goes on and on and on. So none of that is new. In most cases, those codes and restrictions are good for the community and the local church once you finally get your building built. So I just don't think what's happening in our country is onerous, Stanley said. So hearing both of their perspectives in that article, it really gets me back to something that I talked about before, that I think where you live really plays a lot into how you see the situation. Andy Stanley in Georgia, I just think that where they are is a different context than California. And so I do think that has a lot to do with how these churches feel in their environment. I think that's part of it. Their theology also plays into it too. But being out in California, the government restrictions there are really tight in certain places. From what I know, you're not allowed to meet indoors at all in LA County, for example. So that definitely plays into how you feel the government is handling this situation. And there have been heavy fines in California, as I've been talking about, for churches that choose not to follow these health orders. So if your government is being really restrictive and charging you heavy fines and coming down really hard on you, you can definitely see how that would affect the way that you look at this situation. If you're in an area like I live in New Hampshire, the government has been really quite hands-off and cooperative with churches and other entities, so that helps a lot. But as I elaborated in my last video, Stanley and MacArthur do have different theological perspectives in terms of how the church and the world see each other and relate to each other, and so that definitely plays a lot into this as well. One other big thing in this situation that I keep getting back to, and you can hear it again with MacArthur and Stanley here, is that MacArthur is saying that this situation is not highly dangerous, whereas Pastor Stanley does feel like this is a big situation that the government is handling. I think as you really look at this situation, I mean, you can see President Trump has said at times that this virus is really serious, we need to take it seriously. At the same time, from what I know, President Trump has actually backed up John MacArthur and what he's doing specifically in his situation in California. So I think that shows there's a balance here in this situation, that even the federal government is trying to figure out what this balance is. And local governments definitely have different ways they're trying to handle the situation. And when you think about local governments, some of them are dealing with very large populations like LA County, where it seems like recently the disease has been spreading more. Other governments are in places where there's a lower population and it's just a lot easier to handle the whole situation. But again, as I've said so many times, this situation has been complicated by assessing the actual level of risk and determining what that level of risk actually is. And so some people like Pastor MacArthur do not feel it's a very high level of risk. Obviously, Pastor Stanley feels it's a high enough level of risks that he feels it's loving your neighbor not to meet in large crowds indoors. So where you live, your theological position, and the level of threat you feel that the COVID-19 situation poses all plays into how you look at this situation. I know from reading the comments on my videos that all of these factors that I'm talking about play into how you look at this situation. So it's really interesting to read your comments. Feel free to leave comments below. Just make sure that you try to keep those comments positive and edifying to discussion. But those are just some things I wanted to share with you, a little bit more on the perspectives of MacArthur and Stanley. Thank you so much for listening to what I have to say from A Frisch Perspective.